There is a particular quality to the silence of an abandoned place that is unlike any other kind of silence. It is not the silence of an empty field or an open sea, where the absence of human noise feels natural and expected. It is the silence of rooms that were built to be filled, of doorways that were made to be crossed, of hearts that were designed to burn. It is a silence with the shape of human life pressed into it, a negative space where presence used to be. And when you stand inside it long enough, you begin to feel the weight of everything that is missing. In the 14th century, that silence settled over more of Europe than it had in living memory or would again for generations. Castles that had thundered with the business of lordship stood empty on their hills. Houses whose walls had absorbed the sounds of families going about their days fell quiet and began, slowly and inevitably, to fall apart. Streets that had been the arteries of towns, carrying the constant pulse of commerce and argument and laughter and grief, went still in ways that astonished and terrified the people who witnessed them. This is the story of abandonment in 14th century Europe, and it is one of the most haunting chapters in the long history of this continent. The 14th century was the century of catastrophe, a period in which a series of overlapping disasters, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, the Black Death of 1347 to 1351 and its subsequent waves, the Hundred Years' War between England and France, peasant revolts, economic collapse, and the crisis of the Church, stripped Europe of a proportion of its population and its confidence that it had never lost before. But the story of abandonment is not simply a story of disaster and death. It is also a story of the choices that surviving people made in the aftermath of catastrophe, the places they left behind and the reasons they left them, and what those empty places tell us about the world that existed before the silence fell. To understand the scale of abandonment that the 14th century produced, we need to hold in mind one number above all others. By the most reliable estimates, the Black Death alone killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1353. Some regions were harder hit than others. Some communities lost 80 or 90% of their members, while neighboring villages survived with lighter losses. But across the continent, as a whole, the death toll was of a magnitude that simply defies easy comprehension. Europe in 1300 had a population of somewhere between 70 and 80 million people. By 1400, that population had fallen to perhaps 45 or 50 million, and some estimates put it even lower. The continent had lost, in the space of roughly 2 generations, somewhere between a quarter and a half of every human being who had been alive at its start. What does a landscape look like when a third of its inhabitants are gone? The answer, which the 14th century provided with terrible clarity, is that it looks abandoned. Not everywhere and not all at once, but progressively, patch by patch, as communities lost the critical mass of people needed to maintain the activities that kept them viable. A village that had 50 families in 1340 and 15 by 1360 was not simply a smaller village. It was a village in the process of becoming something else, in the process of tipping from a living settlement into a relic, because certain functions of community life require certain minimum numbers of people to sustain them. You need a minimum number of farmers to maintain the field systems. You need a minimum number of craftsmen to keep the essential trades operating. You need a minimum number of children being born to replace the people who die of ordinary causes in any given year. When your population falls below those minimums, the community begins to unravel, and the unraveling, once begun, tends to accelerate. The abandoned castle of the 14th century is perhaps the most visually dramatic form of abandonment that the period produced, and it is also one of the most complex because castles were not simply buildings. They were systems, networks of human obligation and economic extraction that radiated outward from the stone walls and towers into the surrounding landscape. And when the system failed, the building that had been its physical center became something different almost immediately. A castle without a functioning household was not merely an empty building. It was a building that was actively losing its reason for existing, and the 14th century produced that condition through several distinct mechanisms that are worth examining separately. The most straightforward mechanism was simple death. A lord who died of the plague without an heir, or whose heir also died before they could take possession, left a castle without anyone to maintain it. The legal machinery of medieval inheritance, which was complex and slow-moving even in normal times, became overwhelmed during the plague years by the sheer number of simultaneous deaths and inheritance disputes that required resolution. A castle might sit without a clear legal owner for months or years while lawyers and courts worked through the competing claims of distant relatives, creditors, and feudal superiors. And in the meantime, the staff who had maintained it drifted away. The provisions ran out, and the physical fabric of the building began to deteriorate without the daily labor that kept it functional. Stone castles were more durable than timber structures, and a stone tower could stand for centuries without active maintenance, which is why so many ruined medieval castles still the European landscape today. But durability is not the same as functionality. And the 14th century produced many castles that were structurally intact but functionally dead, their gates hanging open or sagging on corroded hinges, their great halls empty of furniture that had been removed by creditors or scavenged by local people, their kitchens cold and dark, their wells silting up without the regular cleaning that kept them usable. These were not ruins in the picturesque sense that later centuries would romanticize. They were functional failures, evidence of broken systems, and the people who lived near them understood them. There was another class of castle abandonment in the 14th century that was less dramatic, but in some ways more revealing, and that was the abandonment of smaller, secondary fortifications that had been established during the great castle-building campaigns of the 11th and 12th centuries, and that now, deprived of the population base that had supported them, simply could not sustain themselves. The Motte and Bailey castles and the smaller stone keeps that dotted the countryside of England, France, and the Low Countries had been built when the population was growing, when there were enough people and enough surplus agricultural production to support the administrative overhead of the castle household. When the population collapsed, the economic foundation of many of these smaller establishments went with it, and their lords, if they survived, often consolidated into a single larger and more defensible residence rather than maintaining multiple smaller ones. Walk into the space where one of these abandoned smaller castles stood in, say, 1380, 30 years after the first wave of the plague, and what you would find is a landscape in the process of reclaiming what human habitation had temporarily borrowed from it. The earthworks of the original Motte might still be visible, the great mound of soil on which the original timber tower had stood before stone replaced it, but the stonework above might already be showing the first signs of a slow dismemberment that would eventually reduce it to a grassy mound indistinguishable from a natural hill. Local people, who had no sentimental attachment to the political purposes for which the castle had been built, were already quarrying its stones for their own building projects, a process that would accelerate over the following decades, and that was so universal in post-plague Europe that the quarrying of abandoned buildings for their material became a significant economic activity in itself. The abandoned home presents a different kind of story, more intimate and in many ways more disturbing than the abandoned castle, because the home was the basic unit of human life in the medieval world, the container of everything that mattered most about daily existence. And its abandonment meant not just the failure of a political or economic system, but the extinction of a family. When a house in a medieval village or town stood empty, it was almost always because everyone who had lived in it was dead, or because the survivors had left for somewhere that seemed to offer better prospects. Either way, the house stood as a kind of monument to what had been lost, and the medieval people who lived among these empty houses were not insensible to what they meant. The physical process by which a medieval house abandoned in the mid-14th century became the archaeological site that modern excavators find 8 centuries later is a process that has been reconstructed in remarkable detail by historical archaeologists working across Europe. The first thing that happened when a house was abandoned was that its portable contents were removed either by surviving relatives, by creditors, by the lord to whom the occupants had owed dues, or by neighbors and passers-by who saw no reason why useful goods should go to waste. The furniture, the tools, the cooking equipment, the stored food, the livestock, All of these moved fairly quickly into other hands once it became clear that the occupants were not coming back. What remained were the fixed elements of the house: the walls, the roof, the floor, the hearth, and whatever objects were too heavy, too damaged, or too intimately embedded in the fabric of the building to be easily removed. The next stage of abandonment was the deterioration of the building. Medieval roofs, whether thatch, wooden shingles, or ceramic tiles, depending on region and status, required regular maintenance to remain weatherproof, and without that maintenance they began to fail within a few years. Thatch became waterlogged and began to rot from the top down. Wooden shingles warped and split, allowing water to penetrate the layer beneath. Ceramic tiles, which were heavier and more durable, lasted longer, but eventually broke and slipped if the underlying timbers that supported them began to decay. Once the roof failed, the process of deterioration accelerated dramatically because water entering the building attacked the timber frame, softened the wattle and daub of the walls, froze and thawed in the masonry of stone buildings, and generally worked with patient efficiency to reduce the structure to its component materials. The floor of an abandoned medieval house absorbed evidence of its abandonment in ways that archaeologists have learned to read with remarkable precision. The layer of occupation debris that accumulated on the floor during the building's active life, the dropped food scraps, the ash from the hearth, the animal bones and pottery sherds, and small metal objects that are the inevitable byproduct of daily domestic life, was capped by the material of collapse when the building finally failed. The fallen thatch or tiles or timber of the roof, the collapsed daub of the walls. The accumulated, wind-blown debris of the years between abandonment and collapse. This stratigraphy, this layering of material time, is what allows archaeologists to determine not just that a building was abandoned, but approximately when it was abandoned, how long it stood empty before it collapsed, and sometimes something about the circumstances of its abandonment. The village that lost enough of its households to cross the threshold of viability became something that historians call a deserted medieval village, and the 14th century created more of these than any other period in European history. England alone has more than 3,000 identified deserted medieval village sites, and the overwhelming majority of them were abandoned during or shortly after the plague years of the mid-14th century. France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and other European countries have their own equivalents. Their Wustungen and their villages phantoms and their Odegarder, ghost settlements that survived as names on documents and as crop marks in aerial photographs long after the last inhabitant had gone. The process by which a living village became a deserted one was not always sudden. In some cases, particularly where the village had lost most of its population in a single catastrophic plague visitation, the abandonment was relatively abrupt. The survivors, too few to maintain the field systems and the social institutions of the community, simply left, moving to a neighboring village or to the nearest town, and the village they left behind ceased to function as a settlement almost immediately. In other cases, the process was slower and more drawn out, with the community shrinking gradually over 1 or 2 generations as the survivors failed to reproduce fast enough to replace those who died of ordinary causes, and as the young and the mobile chose to move rather than stay in a place that offered diminishing prospects. The physical appearance of a village in the process of abandonment, a village somewhere between viability and complete desertion, must have been one of the most psychologically uncomfortable landscapes that the 14th century produced for the people who lived in it. Imagine walking through your village in 1360 and counting the empty houses. The house where your neighbors lived before the plague. The house where the blacksmith worked before he died without apprentices. The house where the miller's family had been for 3 generations before the last of them buried each other. These were not anonymous structures. They were the homes of people you had known, and their emptiness was the visible proof of a loss that was still raw and recent, and not yet processed into the safer category of history. The street, in the context of 14th century abandonment, is perhaps the most resonant image of all, because the street was the public dimension of community life, the space where private existence opened into shared existence. And its silence was therefore the silence not just of individual loss, but of collective failure. A street in a living medieval town was never truly quiet during the daylight hours. It was the channel through which the town's commerce flowed, the stage on which its social life was performed, the arena in which its conflicts were played out and its relationships maintained. The sounds of a busy medieval street, the cries of hawkers, the clang of workshops, the arguments and laughter and footsteps of people going about their days, were the sound of a community that was alive and functional. When those sounds died away, the people who remained in the town noticed immediately, and what they noticed disturbed them in ways that went beyond the obvious practical consequences of reduced commerce and broken supply chains. The silence of streets that should have been noisy was a sensory experience of grief and dislocation that contemporaries struggled to find language for, though some of them tried. Giovanni Boccaccio, describing Florence in the plague summer of 1348, captures something of this when he writes about a city in which the normal rhythms of daily life had simply stopped, in which the streets that should have been full of people moving purposefully from one engagement to the next were instead traversed only by the carts collecting the dead. The silence he describes is not peaceful. It is the silence of a machine that has stopped working, of a system that has failed, and it carries the weight of everything that the failure has cost. The towns of 14th century Europe that lost the largest proportions of their populations faced a particular kind of architectural and spatial problem that the survivors had to negotiate practically even as they processed it emotionally. The urban fabric of a medieval town, its streets, its market spaces, its churches, its guild halls, its residential neighborhoods, had been developed over generations to accommodate a certain population. When that population fell by a third or a half, the built environment did not shrink to match. The streets remained where they had been laid. The market square remained the size it had been built to hold a certain number of stalls and a certain crowd of buyers and sellers. The churches remained capable of holding congregations that no longer existed at anything like their previous size. The town's spatial organization persisted, but it no longer fit the population that inhabited it, and the mismatch between the built environment and the reduced community that occupied it was a constant, ambient reminder of what had been lost. Some streets in badly affected towns went from being residential and commercial arteries to being almost entirely empty. The houses along them stood intact but unoccupied, their doors perhaps still on their hinges, their interiors dark and silent, visited only by the animals and the weather. In some cases, these streets were gradually reabsorbed into the active fabric of the town as survivors moved into the empty houses, either because the houses were better than their own, or because the opportunity to claim valuable urban property was one of the unexpected economic windfalls that the plague created for those fortunate enough to survive it. In other cases, the empty streets remained empty for years or decades, quiet fingers of abandonment running through the body of the town, slowly deteriorating until eventually someone made the decision to demolish the derelict structures and repurpose the land. The psychological experience of living among empty houses and silent streets was something that the 14th century had to process without any of the conceptual frameworks that later centuries would develop for understanding trauma, grief, and the long-term consequences of mass death. Medieval people had their own conceptual frameworks, of course, primarily religious ones, and these were both genuinely helpful and genuinely inadequate to the scale of what the plague had done. The Christian theology of death and the afterlife provided a framework for understanding individual deaths and for maintaining hope in the face of loss. But it was less equipped to rest the collective, structural experience of a civilization that had lost a third of itself and could see the evidence of that loss in every empty house and silent street. The church itself was one of the institutions most visibly marked by the abandonment of the 14th century. Parish churches in villages that had been deserted stood empty after their congregations were gone, their priests dead or relocated, their regular rhythms of liturgical life interrupted and eventually ended. Some of these churches were simply locked and left, their fabric deteriorating slowly over the decades and centuries as the elements worked on stonework that no longer received the repairs that an active community would have provided. Others were stripped of their furnishings and fittings by the surviving ecclesiastical authorities or by local people who saw no reason why chalices and altar cloths should molder in an empty building when they could be put to use in a church that still had a congregation. The monasteries of 14th century Europe provide some of the most detailed and most poignant documentary evidence of what abandonment meant in practice, because monastic communities kept records, and those records have in many cases survived. The plague struck monastic communities with particular severity because the communal life of the monastery, with its multiple daily gatherings in the chapter house, the choir, the refectory, and the dormitory, provided ideal conditions for the spread of respiratory infection. Friaries and monasteries that had housed dozens or hundreds of members were reduced, in some cases, to handfuls of survivors. And those survivors faced the peculiar experience of maintaining the routines of a community life designed for many more people in buildings that echoed with the absence of those who had gone. The Benedictine monastery of 100 monks reduced to 20 continued to ring its bells for the canonical hours, continued to process to the choir for the daily offices, continued to observe the rhythms of prayer and work that the rule of Saint Benedict prescribed, but in buildings and spaces whose scale now overwhelmed rather than contained the community that occupied them. The great dormitory with its rows of beds, mostly empty. The long refectory with most of its benches unoccupied. The cloister garth tended by fewer hands than it needed. The monastic life went on, but it went on in a landscape of absence. And the survivors who lived it were navigating that landscape as best they could with the resources, intellectual and spiritual and practical, that they had. The economic consequences of the emptying of buildings and streets in the 14th century were paradoxical in ways that surprised even the people living through them. The immediate economic effects of mass death were catastrophic. The disruption of supply chains, the loss of skilled labor across every trade and profession, the collapse of demand for goods that a reduced population no longer needed, the breakdown of credit relationships as debtors and creditors died simultaneously, and the instruments that recorded their obligations became impossible to enforce. But in the medium term, the survivors of the plague found themselves in economic circumstances that were, for many of them, significantly better than anything they had known before. The labor shortage that resulted from the death of between a third and a half of the workforce gave the surviving workers bargaining power that they had never possessed in the overpopulated, labor surplus economy of the early 14th century. Wages rose, rents fell, land that had previously been competed for intensively became available to tenants at terms that would have been unimaginable before the plague. The empty houses along the silent streets of plague-struck towns were not just monuments to loss. They were also, for the survivors, opportunities, and some of those survivors moved with remarkable pragmatic speed to take advantage of the opportunities that catastrophe had created. This pragmatic taking of opportunity sometimes had a quality that contemporaries found unsettling, and that the documentary record captures with an uncomfortable candor. People who moved into the houses of dead neighbors, who claimed the land of dead relatives, who hired themselves to lords who had previously had no need of their labor at wages that reflected the new balance of supply and demand, were doing rational things in difficult circumstances. But they were also living amid the physical evidence of the deaths that had made their improved circumstances possible, and a mixture of grief and opportunity, of genuine loss and inadvertent gain, was psychologically complex in ways that the period had limited language for expressing, but that the surviving literature and art of the late 14th century reflects with remarkable honesty. The art and literature produced in the decades after the Black Death bears the mark of the abandonment experience in ways that go beyond the obvious plague imagery of the dance of death and the skeletal figure of death itself. There's a quality in the best late 14th century art of attentiveness to the material world, to the specific texture of things, to the particular quality of light in a particular space at a particular moment, that can be read as a response to the experience of mass loss. When so much has been taken away, what remains acquires an intensity, a specificity, a preciousness that it might not have had before. The empty room, the silent street, the abandoned house. These are also, for the surviving artist, a kind of invitation to look more carefully at what is still there, to render with precision and love the objects and spaces and faces that have survived. Boccaccio's Decameron, perhaps the most important literary work produced in direct response to the plague, is full of this quality. The 10 young people who flee Florence for a country villa are not simply escaping the plague. They are also, in a deeper sense, escaping the silence of the emptied city, retreating to a space that they can fill with their own voices, their own stories, their own laughter. The 100 stories they tell are an act of repopulation, a refusal to accept the silence as final, and the vividness and variety of those stories, their delight in the comedy and tragedy of human experience, their insistence on the pleasures of the mind and the body, even in the shadow of mass death, reads as a direct response to the empty streets and silent houses that Boccaccio describes with such horror in his introduction. The physical landscape of abandonment that the 14th century created persisted in the European countryside for much longer than the century itself. The deserted villages that the plague and its associated catastrophes produced did not immediately vanish from the landscape. They persisted as ruins, as field systems visible as earthworks and grass, as names on documents that refer to places where no one any longer lived. In some cases, these ruins became the quarries that supplied building material for the reconstruction that eventually followed. In others, they simply remained, slowly subsiding into the earth, marked by the occasional scatter of pottery sherds or fragments of roof tile that tell the trained eye that a community once existed here and then, at some point in the long 14th century, stopped existing. The roads that had connected deserted villages to each other and to the market towns began to grasp over when the traffic that had kept them open ceased. The field systems that had been maintained by collective peasant labor began to revert to scrub and eventually to woodland when there were no longer enough farmers to work them. This process of ecological reversion was remarkably rapid in the medieval landscape, which was always only 1 or 2 generations of neglect away from being reclaimed by the vegetation that had been cleared to make it. A field that had been plowed for 100 years could begin to show the first signs of scrub invasion within a decade of abandonment. And within a century, it might be indistinguishable from the woodland around it. This ecological reversion, while it represented real loss of human investment and real disruption to communities that had depended on those fields, also had consequences that the surviving people did not immediately perceive as benefits, but that shaped the European landscape for generations after. The abandonment of marginal agricultural land that had been brought into production during the population boom of the 12th and 13th centuries, land that was thin-soiled, poorly drained, or too steep for efficient cultivation, allowed that land to recover its ecological function. The woodlands that re-established themselves on abandoned fields provided timber, firewood, and browse for animals. The reverted pastures supported larger animal populations than the cropland they replaced. The reduction in the intensity of agricultural exploitation of the landscape gave the soil time to recover from the overuse that had contributed to the yield failures of the famine years. There is a strange and uncomfortable truth at the heart of the story of 14th century abandonment. And it is this: the catastrophe that created the silence of the empty streets and the empty houses and the empty castles also created the conditions under which the survivors, and eventually their children and grandchildren, would build something different and in some respects better than what had existed before. The demographic collapse that the plague produced broke the Malthusian trap that had been squeezing European society for generations, the condition in which population growth had outrun the capacity of the land to feed it, and in which the margins of survival for most people were becoming progressively thinner. In the post-plague world, those margins widened. Wages rose, diets improved, the survivors ate more meat, more variety, more food of better quality than their parents had eaten. This is not a comfortable conclusion, and it should not be offered as one. The people who died of the plague did not die so that their survivors could eat better. They died of a disease, and their deaths were tragic, individual, specific losses that the communities that experienced them mourned with genuine grief and remembered for generations. But the historian's obligation is to look at the full consequences of historical events, including the consequences that are not straightforwardly part of the narrative of tragedy, And the full consequences of the 14th century catastrophe include a remaking of European society that eventually, over the course of the following century and more, produced the world from which the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and eventually modernity itself would emerge. The empty streets of the 14th century were not the end of the story. They were a pause, a terrible and costly pause, in which the human landscape of Europe was stripped back and then, slowly and painfully, rebuilt on different foundations. The castles that were abandoned in the Plague years were sometimes reoccupied when new lords eventually claimed the estates they stood on, or they became the quarries from which new buildings were constructed, or they became the ruins that later generations would romanticize and that we still find beautiful and haunting today precisely because of the silence that surrounds them. The empty houses were eventually filled again, or they fell and were replaced by new buildings built for a reduced but gradually recovering population. The silent streets eventually filled with voices again, though not the same voices and not in quite the same way. What the 14th century left behind in the physical landscape and in the historical memory of Europe was not simply the evidence of catastrophe. It was also the evidence of survival, of the stubborn human capacity to continue, to adapt, to rebuild, and to make meaning out of loss in the only way that meaning can be made, by going on living in the spaces between what was lost and what might yet be found. The abandoned castle on its hill, the empty house with its sagging roof and its grass-covered threshold, the silent street where nothing moves but the wind and the shadow of passing clouds. These are not only monuments to what the 14th century destroyed. They are also, read carefully and with the full attention they deserve, monuments to what it could not destroy, to the persistence of human presence in a landscape that had been asked to absorb more loss than it seemed possible to bear. And that bore it, and that went on.